Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. As you can see behind me, my garden is asleep for the winter. I don't really have anything growing right now. You can see little bits of green from my strawberry plants, but really for the most part, the garden is asleep. But as you're watching this video, it is time to start thinking about this coming garden season. That is so exciting. It's time to start seed shopping if you haven't already. It's time to start planning for the garden. That is one of the most exciting times of the year for me. And especially if you're new to gardening, you may be wondering where to start. There's so many possibilities, especially when you get those seed catalogs in the mail. They're just full of possibility. They're full of beautiful pictures and beautiful descriptions of, so many plants that you could grow. But, especially if you're new to gardening, while there is so much possibility there, that can also seem overwhelming. So I wanted to just take a few minutes today to hang out outside on this rare, warm winter day that we have today. And I wanted to talk about some of the vegetables that, in my experience, are some of the easiest that you can grow in the garden. So whenever I'm talking about the easiest vegetables to grow in the garden, or whenever anyone asks me what one plant would I recommend for a beginning gardener to start with, I always go to perennial herbs. Now, I know that's a category and not necessarily a specific plant, but perennial herbs are such a great place to start in the garden because, for one, they're so easy to grow. Two, they're going to save you so much money. I mean, if you go to the store and you purchase those little clamshell packs of fresh herbs, they are pretty expensive. And if you're going to have to buy those over and over again, that's going to add up to quite a bit, where you could just go to your local nursery, spend the same amount that you'd spend on one of those clamshell packs and get a live plant that you can plant in your garden that's going to just give you that amount of herbs over and over and over continuously for years. It's a great bang for your buck. The third reason why I like to recommend perennial herbs is because they just add so much flavor to your cooking. They can just really bring it to a whole other level, and I just think that it is a really great investment, both financially and when it comes to time and resources. It's just a great choice to start with. Now, perennial basically means that the plant is going to come back for multiple years. So whether or not a plant is perennial in your area depends on your weather conditions and your winter conditions. There are a lot of perennial herbs that can handle really severe weather conditions. Here in Connecticut, I'm in Zone 6. And in my area, I find that thyme is a perennial, sage is a perennial, chives, oregano. Those are all reliable perennials, which will survive. They'll survive winter that's even significantly colder than what I have here in Connecticut. If you are slightly farther south of me, I want to say Zone 7, rosemary is a perennial as well, so that's another great option. And even though I have to plant my rosemary year after year, it's not a perennial for me in my zone. I still do put that in this category because it's still really easy to grow. I just have to replace it each year. So when it comes to these plants, these perennial herbs, what I like to do is purchase started plants from a local nursery because, as I said, they're perennial, at least in most areas, which means that you're not going to have to purchase new plants every year. You can plant them once and they should come back reliably for many years. That makes it a really good investment to just purchase the plant once and have it provide you with herbs for many years. For the most part, these plants tend to be really unbothered by pests. Often people will plant these kind of plants around other plants to protect those plants from pests. Because many of them have a really strong aroma, they tend to repel pests, which makes them themselves really easy to grow. So overall, that would be my number one recommendation. The second plant that I want to recommend as being really easy to grow is lettuce. I love lettuce in the garden. Lettuce is beautiful and delicious. Comes in so many different varieties, and you can really, by growing your own lettuce, you can really take a salad to the next level by just choosing the varieties of lettuce that you want to grow and giving yourself, just many varieties to choose from. The reason, or I think one of the reasons why lettuce makes this list as being so easy to grow is the fact that you don't have to start the seeds inside ahead of time. Lettuce is a really quick maturing plant, and it can handle cooler temperatures, which means that you can just stick your seeds in the ground, just cover them with a little bit of soil, water them, and they'll just grow. You don't have to worry about starting them inside. You don't have to worry about grow lights or getting the timing exactly perfect. Lettuce is just really easy and reliable. Now we will be going into, I have a video coming out really soon talking about lettuce, growing lettuce start to finish, and that will go more in depth on the topic of growing lettuce. But overall, it is a really easy plant to grow. Lettuce is actually a cool weather plant, which means that it can handle a little bit of a frost. It can handle some cooler temperatures compared to, say, tomatoes or peppers. You know, those plants really like the heat of summer. Lettuce prefers it a little bit cooler, which means that in most areas you can grow lettuce in the spring and then again in the fall, possibly early summer. If you live in an area with cooler summers, you may be able to grow it all summer long. But for the most part, I find that in my area, lettuce tends to kind of die out in the summer, which honestly I'm okay with, because in the summer there are so many other fresh, delicious plants in the vegetable garden, and lettuce kind of fills that little bit of a, I don't really want to say a void because there's so many amazing cool weather plants, but lettuce kind of fills in at the beginning of the season and again at the end of the season when there isn't as much to choose from. So I just sprinkle my lettuce seeds really thickly, and I just harvest my lettuce using the cut and come again method. Again, we'll talk more detail about that in an upcoming video. And that just gives you harvest after harvest of delicious lettuce, you know, for many, many weeks. So I would say this is definitely a must grow. Very easy, very reliable, and of course delicious. So next I want to mention beans. Now when you're growing beans, there's two main categories of beans that you could grow in your garden. There are what's called bush beans, which tend to stay a little bit shorter and don't need to be supported. And then there's what are called pole beans, you know, originally called that because they were traditionally grown up a pole. Those beans, pole beans, get much taller and they need support. So both types of beans are extremely easy to grow. Really, the main difference as far as how you grow them is that pole beans need something to climb on. So when I first started gardening, I first started growing beans, it seemed a little bit intimidating to me trying to incorporate some sort of support into the garden, trying to choose some sort of support for my pole beans to climb on. And so I started with bush beans. Now I find that I actually prefer pole beans, but both are definitely worth growing, both are easy, and both are delicious. So part of what makes beans so easy to grow is that similarly to lettuce, you don't have to start the plants inside ahead of time. Now, one thing that's different than lettuce is that beans are not frost tolerant at all, so you need to wait until after your last frost has passed in the spring to start your beans. So in my area, that's around mid-May. So I usually wait about a week or so after that to put bean seeds in the ground. But you know, at that point, you just stick them in the ground about an inch or so deep. And honestly, they're gonna pretty much do the rest. So beans, in my experience, have not had significant pest issues. I know there are pests that can bother beans, and I have had to deal with some of those pests, but they have never bothered my beans to the point where they really impacted the harvest, to the point where I really had to do anything about them. I found that for the most part, my beans were really resilient, and they were able to recover from the minor pest damage that they did have. So, you know, you don't have to start your beans inside. They just grow and they're carefree. Another reason why I think that they are so easy is, at least in my experience, they have been really reliable. I don't think I've ever had a year that I've grown beans that I haven't had a decent harvest from them. Now, some years are better than others, as with everything, but overall I find beans really easy, really reliable, and I definitely recommend growing them if that's something that you like to eat. Next, I want to mention peas, which are similar. You know, they're in the same family as beans. Peas and beans are both legumes, so they grow similarly. One major difference between peas and beans is that peas are cold tolerant. So peas don't prefer the heat of summer, they prefer cooler temperatures. Similarly to what we were saying with lettuce, peas like to be planted in the spring, and in some areas you can also get a second crop of peas in the fall. In my area, peas tend to kind of die out as summer goes on and it starts to get really hot. But, you know, I have had time to get a really nice crop of peas before that point. So in my garden, we grow snap peas. Those are peas where you eat the seeds and the shell all together. If you prefer shelling peas, you could grow those. I don't personally have experience with shelling peas. Those are a little bit less easy just because you have to go through the additional step of shelling them. And I think they take usually a little bit longer to really be ready, just because they need to get a little bit farther along in their growth cycle. So, as I said, I don't really have experience growing shelling peas. We prefer snap peas because I think that you get a little bit more bang for your buck as far as the time investment. We don't have to shell them. You get a larger harvest, I think, in a smaller space because you're eating the pod as well. And we just really like them. You know, they're just crisp and juicy and delicious, and we really enjoy eating those in the early summer garden. So I definitely recommend those. Now, peas, for the most part, will need something to climb on. There might be a few varieties of peas that have been bred to be a little bit shorter and may not really need support. But in my experience, even peas that are described as being a little bit shorter do benefit from having a little bit of support. So I just grow my peas along my garden fence. I just plant them about an inch or so apart in the soil. I stick them in the soil about an inch or two deep, and they just climb up the fence and they just do really well. I find them pretty untroubled by pests. You know, I will have aphids that feed on my peas a little bit, but I have never had enough of a problem with aphids that it was really worth my time to deal with them. So, you know, they just kind of nibble a little bit. It doesn't really affect my harvest, so I just let them be. So I find peas really reliable. I find them really delicious. So I do definitely recommend growing peas in the garden. The next vegetable that I want to mention is garlic. Now, garlic is actually quite a bit different as far as how it grows compared to the other vegetables that we're talking about in this video. First of all, garlic is not grown using seeds. Garlic is, for the most part, grown using cloves. You know, when you get a head of garlic from the grocery store, it's a head, but it has all those individual cloves that you can break it into. When you're planting garlic, those cloves are what you plant in the ground like a bulb. And those cloves will multiply, and each clove will form an entire head. Now, another thing that makes garlic a little bit different than some of the other vegetables that we're talking about is the fact that you plant garlic in the fall. For the most part. There are some exceptions. Some areas of the country and some specific varieties of garlic are planted in the spring. But in my experience, fall planted garlic, at least in my area, tends to yield a lot more and a lot more reliably than spring planted garlic does. So I stick with fall planted garlic. So I know that makes this video not really seasonally appropriate when it comes to garlic, because everything else we're talking about is, you know, spring planted, and we're actually getting ready to think about buying seeds and starting some of these plants now. Garlic is planted in the fall, but I did want to mention it in this video because it's just so easy to grow, because it's so rewarding to grow. And if you are thinking of growing garlic, you can prep a spot for it now. You can even grow something else in that spot throughout the season, and just be planning ahead and set aside a spot in your garden where you can plant some garlic in the fall. So garlic is really easy. You just you break the garlic head into its individual cloves, you plant those in the fall, and then I just give it a nice blanket of mulch to keep it warm for the winter. And in the spring, it just grows. Garlic, you know, being in the onion family, is also really unbothered by pests, at least in my experience. You know, things in the onion family are not usually bothered by pests because they have that strong aroma and flavor. You would actually use those types of plants to protect other plants, to kind of repel pests from your other more sensitive plants. So that means they in themselves, at least in my experience, are not really troubled by pests. So I find garlic really easy to grow. Another thing that I really like about garlic, the fact that it's planted in the fall, means that when spring comes and it's time to really get into gardening season, my garlic is already planted and done. When I'm busy with a lot of other garden tasks, I don't have to worry about planting garlic. That's one bed, that's all set, and I can just let it grow. I do also really enjoy growing garlic because it stores for so long. It gives me something that I can enjoy fresh from the garden when the rest of the garden is sleeping and there's very little out here that I can harvest. I still have my garlic hanging in my garage that I can go use, and I can just enjoy garlic fresh from my garden, even though the garden itself might be buried under a foot of snow. So I really enjoy garlic for that reason. You know, obviously it adds a lot to your cooking. It also has a lot of medicinal uses as well. So it's definitely something that I really recommend and is really worth growing. So next we are going to talk about cucumbers. Cucumbers are one of the classic summer vegetables. They're so good, so refreshing on a hot summer day, and also very easy to grow. So you're going to kind of see a little bit of a theme in this list which is that cucumbers also don't have to be started inside for the most part. Often I do start some of my cucumbers inside because I have had issues with slugs eating my cucumber seedlings when they first sprout outside. If you don't have that issue, you can go ahead and start your seeds directly outside. Cucumbers actually prefer to be direct sown rather than transplanted. They're one of those plants that don't really like their roots disturbed that much. So if you're able to get them started outside and not have them be troubled by pests, then that is definitely an easy thing to do. If you do have a problem with cucumber seedlings getting eaten by pests, it is really easy to start them inside. What I actually do sometimes, if I don't have room in my house or I just don't feel like messing with grow lights or anything like that, is I will start them in pots on my deck. You know, in pots on my deck, the slugs can't get to them, so they're protected. They're already going to grow up used to outdoor conditions. They're going to grow up used to sunshine, but I don't have to worry about them getting eaten by slugs. I also don't have to worry about using space in my house for them to grow and using grow lights. So that's something that I will do occasionally. If starting them by seed is kind of intimidating to you, then feel free to go to your local nursery and purchase some cucumber seedlings. You know, it's usually only a few dollars. It's great to support a local business, and then you are still getting a great quality product that in the most cases will be acclimated to your area. So, you know, my first year gardening, I didn't start very much from seed because I was a little intimidated, and I just purchased seedlings from my local nursery. That is really a great way to get started, to learn how plants grow without having to worry about actually starting seeds. That being said, I love starting seeds. You have a lot more variety and selection when you start from seed, so if that's something that you're interested in, I definitely recommend doing a little bit of research and learning how to do it, because it's honestly not as hard as it seems. We will be talking about that a lot more as I actually start my seeds this year. But, you know, personal preference. If you are intimidated by that, there is nothing at all wrong with just purchasing seedlings at your local nursery. So the final two plants that I'm going to mention are plants that do need to be started early. So similarly to what I said about cucumbers, if you don't want to go through the process of starting these seeds yourself inside, again, both of these plants can easily be purchased at a local nursery. If you want to try it yourself, then go ahead and give it a try, because honestly, it's not that difficult. And you can always give it a try. If you're not successful, then you have your backup of being able to purchase seedlings at a local nursery. So the next plant that we're going to talk about is cherry tomatoes. You know, tomatoes are probably the classic, you know, I mentioned this a little bit about cucumbers, but tomatoes probably even more, are the classic summer vegetable, the classic summer garden vegetable. You know, I love tomatoes. Tomatoes are my favorite thing that I grow in the garden. Some tomatoes can be a little bit finicky. You know, large slicer tomatoes, especially heirloom tomatoes, can be a little bit more prone to disease or a little bit more prone to pests in some cases. I still think that they're worth growing. But since the focus of this video is on really easy plants to grow, we're going to talk today about cherry tomatoes. I find that cherry tomatoes will yield more reliably. A lot of times I get a larger harvest from cherry tomato plants than I do from some of my specialty slicing tomatoes. And I find that cherry tomatoes are a little bit less picky about conditions when it comes to providing you with a yield. They can grow in a smaller space. I find that it's easier to grow cherry tomatoes in pots than it is to grow larger tomatoes in pots. They adjust more easily to a smaller growing space, I think. So I find them to be a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more reliable. That being said, don't let this list limit you at all. If you have your heart set on growing delicious, fresh heirloom tomatoes, then go ahead and grow those. You know, I'm choosing the easiest vegetables for this list, but that doesn't mean that the others are unattainable or, you know, really even that intimidating. What you'll find is that you will be most inspired to grow what you're most excited to harvest and eat. So if there's something, you know, I still have one more plant to get to, which we'll get to in a second. But if there's something that you have your heart set on growing that I haven't included in this list, go ahead and give it a try anyway. You may also find that in your area and your particular growing conditions, you may find that your list of easier vegetables is not the same as mine. So I just wanted to give that little caveat. Don't feel limited at all by this list. I just wanted to share a starting point in case you're not really sure where to start. So on to the final plant that I would put on my easy to grow list. and that is small fruited pepper plants. Now, peppers in general are a little bit more challenging than a lot of other plants that you could grow in the garden. But what I find is that smaller fruited peppers, for example, jalapenos, also shishito peppers, for the most part, I find hot peppers to yield a little bit better in my experience. Bell peppers and some of the larger sweet peppers can be a little bit more finicky. They don't always yield as much, but what I have found is that I can depend on my harvest from my jalapeno plants, my shishito pepper plants like that. I find that they grow really well in pots. They give me a reliable yield every year. So those are plants that I can depend on. Now, peppers, similarly to tomatoes, do have to be started inside, at least in most climates. If you have an exceptionally long growing season, you may be able to just stick a seed in the ground and grow peppers that way. Most people do need to start their peppers early inside. Here in Connecticut, we definitely do have to start peppers early inside. Again, we'll talk more about that when it's actually time to start seeds. But again, I start my pepper plants usually about 8 to 10 weeks before I expect them to go out into the garden, which is usually about 8 weeks or so before my last frost. If, again, that is something that you don't want to do, you don't want to devote the resources and the time to that, then go ahead and pick up some seedlings at your local nursery. And again, feel free to try any peppers that interest you. I just find that I have the most reliable yield when it comes to things like jalapenos and shishito peppers. So I hope that list is helpful as a starting point. You know, I'm just going to mention again, I am not sharing this list for the purposes of trying to limit anybody or to make anything else feel like it is unattainable or overwhelming. I just wanted to give a starting point for people who may not really be sure where to start. So I hope that is helpful to you. If you have experience growing plants and you want to add something to my list, something that you have found to be really reliable and really easy to grow that I didn't mention, please go ahead and mention that below. I know some people will probably wonder why I didn't have zucchini and summer squash on my list. I have found that while those have a reputation of being very easy to grow, they honestly probably could have made the list. I find that I don't get that crazy yield from my zucchini plants that a lot of people talk about. So they didn't quite make my list, but that doesn't mean that they are challenging to grow. Probably many of you would have those on your list of easy plants to grow. So again, if there's anything that you think should be on this list that I did not include, go ahead and leave that in the comments below. If you have a different experience with any of these plants that I've mentioned than I have, I would love to hear your experience as well. And also go ahead and let me know what you're most excited to try growing, whether you're an experienced gardener or whether this is your first season with a garden. I would love to know what you're excited to try this year. So I hope you're having a great day. I can't wait to get into seed starting season, which is coming up really soon, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.